Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for the final Crown Seminar of the 2020-21 academic year, which, as we all know, has been a year like no other. I'm David Siddharth Patel, the Associate Director for Research, and we'd like to welcome from, normally from down the Mass Turnpike, Pouya Alimagham from, he's a lecturer in history at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, but he's currently in California. I'll post full bios in the chat, but I thought it is important to mention that Pouya teaches or co-teaches, among other courses at MIT, a course called How to Stage a Revolution. The discussant today will be our own Hadi Kahalzadeh, who's a PhD fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies and a PhD candidate in social policy at the Brandeis Heller School. I should mention Hadi also served as a member of the board of several political parties and pro-democratic civil society organizations in Iran, during the period of today's topic, which is the Green Revolution in Iran. So as I mentioned, both bios will be posted in the chat. We're going to go from 11 until 12:15 today, so there'll be plenty of time for your questions. Pouya will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes on his book, followed by conversation, discussion, questions from Hadi for about 7 to 10, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Please ask your questions via the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, just hover over the bottom of your Zoom chat and it should open up. There will be a chat open, and feel free to use the chat, but panelists will not be monitoring it. Crown Center staff will though. So again, if you have questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A button and not the chat. This session is being recorded, and without further ado, please, Pouya.
All right, thank you so much. It's such a wonderful feeling to be with you guys all. Before I begin, I just want to give a special thank you to the Crown Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Professor Gary Seymour, Professor Naghmeh Sohrabi for the invitation, and thank you to you, David, Karen, and Hadi for helping to organize this. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I very much look forward to one day being able to see you guys in person, especially since we're, like you said, down the street more or less from one another. I do have slides for you all. Let me just get them up and running real quick. I've always been really big on slides. They help. We're going to talk about essentially the book, the methodology, the argument, the central argument, why I chose this cover, some of the chapters, and especially what my hopes are with the book and how I hope it is received, I guess. Without further ado, I'll begin with the book's origin story. I remember this is 2009, June. I was all the way in California at the time before I started the PhD program at the University of Michigan. And I saw the footage from the campaigns, and it struck me as something very different than what was in the air typically in other campaigns in Iran's presidential past. And something was afoot, essentially. And it seemed more like a street movement than a campaign. And so that's really what kind of tuned me in to take interest in it. And then obviously as it morphed from a campaign to an uprising, there was this discussion that this was what was happening in Iran between the uprising and also its figureheads like Mir Hossein Mousavi, Mehdi Karoubi, Zahra Rahnavard. This was kind of an internal power struggle between the regime and itself, essentially. And I disagreed with that summation. And I thought that the uprising was not an outburst of reformist energy, but it was a revolution in and of itself. And the reason why I felt that way wasn't because I was imposing my own ideas and beliefs onto it, but really because the uprising itself and its participants, through their methods of action, really convinced me that this was something much bigger than reform or reformism. And so I especially liked how a lot of their protest actions, a lot of their slogans, a lot of the symbolism of the Green Movement, the Green Uprisings, was very much rooted in the revolution itself, the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79, but very much reprogrammed. The symbolism had been co-opted, reprogrammed, and then leveled against the system that had come to power through that very revolution. And that to me was very, very interesting. And then when the dust settled, there was a lot of discourse, especially in the Western media, about how this was this was discourse not only in Western media, but by the Iranian government itself, that this was, a failure. I mean, they didn't call it a failed revolution. We heard that much more in the West. We heard also how this uprising was over. The Iranian government called it a failed sedition, essentially. But I didn't think of it as a failure, and I didn't think of it as being over either, right? I feel like there was a lot of successes to the uprising. If we're able to kind of unpack these win, lose, start, finish binaries, then we're able to kind of uncover some very important successes to the uprising, and also how really it's not over, and how it has pollinated future protest movements since 2009. Naturally, the protests that have happened in Iran since are not at all about, Ahmadinejad's election win in 2009 and overturning that win, so-called win. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying you can still see how the uprising has pollinated protest movements since 2009. Their discourses, their strategies, the shattering of the taboo of criticizing the Iranian government's supreme leader, and so on and so forth. So when I saw these discourses and these strategies, that's really when I began to think of a dissertation project that complicated these narratives. Before I had started the PhD program, when I had applied, I had something entirely different in mind. And then basically the uprising happened the summer before I began the PhD program. And I followed it from the beginning through the first year of my program, and it really kind of changed basically my entire research project going forth since that moment. One of the aims of the book was really to kind of transcend typical focuses on states and powerful men of history. I really wanted to center the popular forces on the ground that made this uprising or this revolution. And so if you look carefully, the book is not, the cover is not about Mir Hossein Mousavi, right? So Mir Hossein Mousavi was the main, reformist or opposition candidate. He's the one that, him and a couple others are the ones that alleged election fraud, and the uprising crystallized around his campaign. But the cover is not about him. Right, so that's him, but the cover is really about the woman holding his campaign image or his campaign poster. The idea really is to center the women and men who were on the ground that made this history, and oftentimes they made it without the direction of the opposition leaders and caught them by surprise. So when I was searching for a cover and I saw this, it very much spoke to how I had framed a lot of this history and this argument. I like the fact that, one, it's a woman. I like the fact that she's holding up a, depending on who you're talking to, it could either be a V for victory sign, which I liked because I thought that the Green Movement was not a failure, but it was actually very triumphant in so many ways. And I obviously unpacked this in the book. But also, depending on who you're talking to, she could also be holding a peace sign. And that's really important too, because this was very much a non-violent movement. There was obviously very rare and sporadic moments of violence, but it was by and large extremely non-violent. I like the fact that she's wearing green, right? Because this became the campaign color. Interestingly, when the Mousavi campaign adopted the color green, the green being the color of Islam, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, all of a sudden was terrified about the fact that this campaign was starting to look like a street movement even before the elections, and it had a color. It reminded them of the color revolutions or velvet revolutions of Europe or Central Europe or Central Asia. And so it became, the IRGC became extremely nervous, but nonetheless, the color green became really important, right? It became an identity marker. People began to identify themselves even when the government had pushed the uprising underground. So I like this image because she's wearing green. I like the fact that she's wearing a full, basically Islamic veil. And that kind of complicates the narrative that if you're religious, then you're going to be behind Ahmadinejad or the Iranian government. And if you're extremely secular, then therefore you're going to be in the opposition. Here you have somebody with at least visible markers of piety, who is essentially with the main opposition candidate. So I like that it complicated those narratives. I think probably the most important thing I liked about it is the fact that she's covering her face. So she's trying to conceal her identity for this photographer, because there is, of course, the issue of political repression in Iran and obviously during the uprising. So this kind of speaks to a lot of the intensity and importance of the people and the realities that we're facing during this uprising, and it decenters Musavi, which is what I really wanted to do with this book. What I also wanted to do was extrapolate this revolutionary discourse. Many of the Iranian government's sources of legitimacy are rooted in the Iranian Revolution and Shiism and Islam as a whole. And you see how the uprising basically co-opts this self-legitimating Islamic revolutionary discourse and Shiite symbolism, co-opts it, reprograms it, and levels it as attacks that targeted the core of the Iranian government. So this is what I mean when I say that the uprising may have been a failure in the sense that it was unable to abrogate the election, the so-called election win of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the incumbent president. And it was also a failure in the sense that it was unable to overthrow the system that ratified his so-called election win. But it was victorious in so many other ways, such as targeting and appropriating the government's sources of legitimacy. And probably in chapter 5, the most obvious example is how, the Iranian government's sources, one of its main sources of legitimacy is obviously the revolution in Islam. And in particular, the fact that the revolution really culminates on December 10th, 1978 on the Ashura Day processions. Ashura being the anniversary of the martyrdom of the Prophet Muhammad's grandson, Imam Hussein. You see that the revolution really really hits a crescendo in 1979 on Ashura. And Khomeini himself had styled the revolution and the Iranian government that was born of it as being the flag bearers of Hussein's just cause of resisting and fighting oppression. And then you see in the Green movement itself on Ashura, December 27th, 2009, Green movement activists coming out and equating the Iranian government with the murderers of Hussein, and themselves as the righteous band of followers who are now raising the flag of Hussein against the very government that claims that mantle, which is why it was so interesting to me. And this is what I mean when I say extrapolate Islam and revolutionary of protest and social movement activity. This is really very much present in the intro and conclusion. In the conclusion, this is how I'm able to tie the uprising of 2009 to future protest events in Iran, 2017, 2018. And I think I was able to kind of go back right before its publication and insert something about the 2019 protests, if I remember correctly. In chapter 4, I talk about really why Palestine became so important to revolutionary Iran, and how the Iranian government institutionalized Palestinian liberation as government symbolism. Like, for instance, the first Friday of the first Ramadan after the Iranian Revolution, Khomeini himself declared that its last Friday of the holy month would henceforth be a day of solidarity with the Palestinians known as Yom al-Quds, Jerusalem Day. And then the Iranian government kind of inculcates an entire generation for 30 years that was raised under its banner with the symbols of Palestinian liberation. And then you see in the Green Movement protests that symbolism backfiring. Whereas basically on Jerusalem Day 2009, protesters came out and they said two things mainly: Na Gaza, na Lebanon, Janam Fadai Iran. No to Gaza, no to Lebanon, my life is only for Iran. And that was really a way of negating the Iranian government negating Palestine to negate the Iranian government, right? So if the Iranian government legitimized itself by supporting Palestinian liberation, now you had protesters saying no to it all. Or you also saw them say, Madam chera neshastin, Iran shode Palestine. Oh, people, why are you sitting when Iran has become Palestine? The idea being that these protesters were now using the discourse of the state to equate themselves with oppressed Palestinians and equate the Iranian government with the occupation or usurpation of power, right? This is what the Iranian government had been teaching its population, and now the population was using it in a counter-programmed manner. And also really kind of just wanted to provide a history of modern Iran, but with obvious emphasis of focusing on 1979 all the way to the present. As you can tell from the title of the book, it's called Contesting the Iranian Revolution, the Green Uprisings. So the story kind of begins with 1979 and goes all the way to 2009 and onwards. And whenever I could, I did insert the fact that as a reminder that a lot of this history also goes back and back and back, such as with the Anglo-American overthrow of Dr. Mossadegh in 1953, and even further back as far as I could do so in a reasonable manner. Usually I have a recorded preface. It takes about 7 minutes long, but to kind of, for the sake of brevity today, I'm really going to kind of summarize the preface for you, if you don't mind. Essentially, for me, in the preface, I kind of wanted to inform the reader of my own intentions of the book. I was very worried that and I was very honest in the preface saying that this book may become very inconsequential. Maybe no one's going to read it. I don't know. It's hard to tell. It's my first book. But just to clear my own conscience, I want to make sure that people understood that whoever the readers are, that this book, while it's true, I tried to make it as true to the history that unfolded in 2009 onwards, and kind of showcase the brutality of the Iranian government as it treated its own people. In no way should this be taken as a license for hawkish foreign policies. And I said so because I was very well aware of my own positionality as an Iranian in the United States, especially since the book came out during the Trump presidency, when many times we were on the brink of war with Iran. I just felt like in the preface I should include this so I don't inadvertently help with this war effort with Iran, because it's certainly not something that I want. But also because the book is in a way autobiographical. When I went to Iran as an adult for the first time, I was born in Iran and I've been back as an adult. I went to Be'esh Zahra Cemetery. I went to the martyrs section of the cemetery, where literally hundreds of thousands of Iranians who fought in the Iran-Iraq War were laid to rest. And unbeknownst to myself, I ended up being there on a Thursday evening, which is this is what's unbeknownst to me, is that Thursday evening, a lot of families and mothers in particular gather alongside those graves and end up washing the gravestone and bringing treats to give the passersby, with the hope that the passerby would pray for the souls of their departed. And it's a very solemn place. There are Islamic hymns playing in the background. And then, unlike other gravestones elsewhere, there's pictures, encased pictures of the fallen above the gravestones. So you kind of really, it's not just something that is detached. You kind of see the faces like you see in the images in the slide. And so my father was with me, and we ended up speaking to a lot of these families. And I ended up speaking with one mother who said something to me that kind of stayed with me throughout the research and writing of this book. And she basically said that, I hope my son didn't die in vain. And this generation, it's right here. This generation fixes Iran's problems. And that stayed with me. And really what I wanted to do in the book was showcase how this generation has risen to the challenge in a way. All right. Central argument. I argue that the Green Uprising is a manifestation of how large segments of Iranian society, including revolutionary leaders and clerics, are moving beyond the rigidity of the Islamist ideology in favor of a more pluralistic system. That is not to say that this was a movement of atheists or irreligion, but one that stressed civic rights over religious duties to save religion from the state that operates under the rubric of a narrow religious interpretation. Right? The idea being that Islam is too grand to be confined to the mundane trappings of the state. right? And I think probably the best argument that I was able to harness for this point is the case study of Ayatollah Montazeri, which is essentially the first half of chapter 5. The book also situates the history of the Green Uprising within Iran's long history of contentious politics, as well as the revolutionary history of the region. Because the uprising predates the Arab uprisings, the book also considers its connectivity to 2011 and how the Arab Spring, in turn, impacted the Green movement when opposition leaders tried to harness its momentum to rekindle their revolt. How are we doing on time? Okay, good. Methodology. As I said, I very much tried to decenter the state and powerful men of history. This was in the tradition of the British Marxist historians. This is a history from below or bottom-up approach that centers the people. And this was not only introduced to me through the British Marxist tradition, but also Abrahamian, who took that tradition and applied it to Iranian studies. Interestingly, while this book is still very much about half of it focuses on the Iranian Revolution, the literature of the Iranian Revolution very much informed the methodology of this book. So Mansour Moaddel's Class, Politics, and Ideology in the Iranian Revolution, excuse me, was very important. Charles Kurzman's book on the unthinkable revolution in Iran, Opportunity and his Anti-Explanation, instrumental. Misaq Parsa's Resource Mobilization and Solidarity Structures. Basically, all three books are books of sociology, and so is the fourth one, Post-Islamism. This is probably the most important book to my framing and methodology in my book, Asafaya and Making Islam Democratic. A really quick overview. The 2009 10th presidential elections. This is when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was the incumbent seeking re-election. He had won in 2005, largely because after 8 years of reformist presidency that ended in deadlock, a lot of the youth boycotted the 2005 election. And that's very similar to what happens in the United States. When the youth boycott, typically conservatives win the presidency. And so this happened in Iran. And then there was calls again, especially from the Iranian diaspora, from which I come, for further boycotts in 2009. But this time it was different. A lot of the youth and a lot of women who were aware of the fact that the elections in Iran are highly screened and vetted and controlled, and that someone that's elected can't really reform the system in a meaningful way because they experienced that with 8 years of Khatami as president. But they still kind of understood that boycotting will lead to a conservative, militarized state, which is what happened with Ahmadinejad, and that had a material impact in their lives. So those renewed calls for boycotts fell on deaf ears, but also because 2009 was a really interesting moment because the Iranian government did not like the fact that it was boycotted. The elections that it provided were boycotted in 2005 and really went above and beyond to get its population interested in the elections. The idea being that if people do not vote or do not participate in this really important political process, they're not participating in a really important state-sanctioned event. And boycotting amounted to a no vote to the system, whereas participating in the eyes of the Iranian government amounted to a yes vote for the system. So the government really kind of wanted people to get engaged in the process. So you see that in the weeks leading up to the election, the typical repressive environment was gradually being lifted. Internet restrictions were decreasing, and the government provided televised presidential debates. Iran has had televised presidential debates, but this was the first time they were one-on-one. And because they were one-on-one, they were more adversarial. And because they were more adversarial, the candidates ended up saying a lot of the things that were taboo to be talked about politically openly. And a lot of people were stunned by the level of honesty and the attacks that they were leveling. Corruption, repression, the police patrols, all these things kind of were being talked about in a national televised debate. So they grew interested in it. But also really, all these decreased repressive environments and all that basically provided a lot of the youth a sense of opportunity. There was something afoot, something was different. So you see them mobilizing behind their candidates for the elections, but really some of them are using the candidates as a cover to begin protesting the government even before any allegations of election fraud. So one of the slogans that were aired in Tehran was "Mag bar Taliban, che dar Kabul, che dar Tehran." Death to the Taliban, whether in Kabul or in Tehran, essentially equating the clergy running the system essentially with the Taliban in Afghanistan. And you saw these slogans even before the protest movement emerged. That's what was really fascinating. This is why the IRGC was terrified about the Green and the street movement, because they also heard these slogans and they felt like the campaigns were morphing into something entirely different. So we have the June 12th election, 2009. And that evening, the election results were declared in favor of Ahmadinejad. And I think emotions got the best of a lot of people. And the next day resulted in rioting. But then really you see the movement kind of crystallize into these mass silent marches to kind of deflect from that bad PR the government was giving it. And then on June 15th, you have this epic march, roughly 3 million people just in Tehran. And then a full week later, you had Khamenei's Friday sermon. And Khamenei doesn't typically give the Friday sermon. And when he does, it's because something really important is happening. And this was indeed something very important. He gave the Friday sermon. My father and I tuned in. We were like awake till like 3 o'clock in the morning in California to watch this because we knew it was going to be important. And, he gives his typical, religious sermon. And at the very end, got into the politics of the day and essentially said that the election results had been ratified by the Guardian Council. They were fair, and that the protest movement now constituted a security threat. The imperialists and the Zionists are at the door, and a security operation will be in full effect. And if there's any bloodshed that is shed in the following days, it will be on the hands of the organizers and the opposition leaders like Mousavi, Rahnavard, and Karoubi themselves. The next day is when Neda Agha Sultan was killed. Her death became the most televised death in world history until that point, and I think since as well. But really what happened was since June 12th, since the election, they were protesting every day, and then they were driven underground. And then when you think it was over, because soon after that crackdown, soon after Khamenei's sermon, they were really driven off the streets, and people thought it was over. But something really interesting happened. It wasn't over. The Iranian government has all these political days baked into its calendar, especially since the revolution, where it wants its supporters to come out in solidarity with the government, like Jerusalem Day. Like I said, Jerusalem Day was founded right after the revolution, or the anniversary of the seizure of the U.S. Embassy. That's a day that since the seizure of the U.S. Embassy on November 4th, 1979, has been a day of like anti-imperialism in solidarity with the Iranian government. On these days, people came out like they typically would in solidarity with the government, but then you see the Green movement using the space of those days where the government was cracking down typically, but then encouraging on those days people to come out. They came out and protested and renewed the uprising. That's why the book is called Green Uprisings as opposed to uprising, because it went from one continuous week-long uprising to multiple individual uprisings spread out for about 6 months along Iran's political calendar. Whoops. All right, we are just about finished. Just hang in there real quick. Now, real quick, a note on the book sources. A lot of the Abrahamian himself, the seasoned historian of Iran, when he releases one of his latest books on Iran, it was at the coup of 1953, he argued in his book, or he complained rather, justifiably so, that accessing American diplomatic files, even 50 or 60 years after the fact, when it comes to Iran, are nearly impossible. But what was interesting about the book sources for this history is that because it was a very modern event that used modern technology, a lot of the sources were digital, right? So I had access to the diplomatic files leaked by Julian Assange or Chelsea Manning, and these were really important reserve of sources. I didn't have to wait 50 or 60 years or maybe 70 or 80 years for the government to declassify them. I had access to them in real time. But also really the activists themselves were their own archivists, right? They were documenting everything and posting it online. So when the Iranian government itself acknowledged, the mayor of Tehran acknowledged 3 million people had come out in Tehran on June 15th, that acknowledgement came down hours later because the Iranian government does not want any official acknowledging 3 million people in one city protesting the Iranian government. But what was fascinating was, like I said, the protesters themselves were their own archivists. So they recorded everything with their not so smartphones. This is 2009, so smartphones hadn't really reached Iran yet, but basically filmed everything through their flip phones. So if you look at this video, this is a really important footage from that June 15th 3 million person march in Tehran alone, and it's breathtaking. You can see it right here. All right, so we don't need to watch the whole thing, but you see, just when you're kind of awe-inspired by its size, the camera turns around and you see that there's really nowhere to tell where it begins or ends, right? So this is how they were able to kind of like archive their own revolution and basically complicate those narratives that 3 million people didn't come out in Tehran when they actually did. So the internet kind of changes how this history was being recorded. If the Iranian Revolution was the world's first televised revolution, the Green Uprising in 2009 was the world's first socially broadcast revolution. So social media, YouTube, interviews with activists penned pieces. They themselves tried to explain their slogans and methods of action. Really, I kind of just pieced it all together. And of course, I contrasted that with state media narratives, right? So you kind of have to understand how the state is approaching this and then how to contrast it. Most of my sources are Persian language sources based in Iran. So they're not BBC Persian, Voice of America, Radio Farda, like State Department funded sources are really non-present in the book. Second to last slide. This is a protest at all girls high school. And what I liked about this, one is that it's super intense, but two is that the camera person is intentionally not showing anybody's faces for security purposes. And it happens on December 7th. Like I said, the movement was driven underground, but then it reemerges on certain days. December 7th is National Student Day. It's a day of political action, especially in the universities and high schools. And this was born essentially after the US overthrew Iran's government in 1953. Then Vice President Nixon came to Iran a couple months later to endorse the coup government, and then the protests broke out at the University of Tehran, and 3 students were killed because obviously the Iranians knew the U.S. hand in this coup. And since 1953, this has become a day of action against imperialism or the Iranian government or both. So if you look real quick at these slogans, you see some of them are slogans from the Iranian Revolution that are now being reprogrammed and leveled at the Iranian government itself. So this is about 60 seconds long. Let's just give it a hear. All right, so slogan 2 and 4 are iconic slogans from the Iranian Revolution that are now being leveled at the government that was born of that revolution. That's my point when I say a lot of these discourses of the revolution were now being reprogrammed and leveled, co-opted and then leveled against the state. Concluding points. The Green Uprising is part of a genealogy of Iranian protests informed by the past and impacting the future. Islam can be used to legitimate the state, but can simultaneously be used to provide a subversive discourse against that very Islamist state. The state does not have a monopoly on Islamic truth. And of course, unilateral US sanctions on Iran have shrunk the already small space for contentious politics. Dissent is seen as part of a US conspiracy in 2009 and now. I just had to throw that in there. I'm sorry. Thank you so much for your time, for being with me. Please support the book. More importantly, if you end up reading it, please don't let it sit in your libraries. Pass it along to somebody, especially if you like it. And again, once again, thank you so much for being with me. And thank you so much to the Crown Center for Middle Eastern Studies for this opportunity to speak.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Pouya. Now we're going to turn to our own Hadi Kahalzadeh to give us comments for approximately 7 to 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to general questions from the audience. If you have questions for either speaker, but please ask them via the Q&A button, which is down at the bottom of your screen. Hadi?
Thank you, David. I'm not a historian nor a political scientist, so I read the book mainly as a former activist who took a part in the gay movement, and I really enjoyed reading your fascinating and deeply informed book. Your bottom-up approach by putting the ordinary Iranians, especially the youth and women, at the center of your analysis, the way the book narrates the history of the gay movement from below, highlighting the importance of the people at the central as a central agent of change, highlighting the agency, rejecting the conspiracy theories regarding the role of the foreign countries in the movement, and echoing the Green Movement message that, as you emphasize in book, that the Iran's future is not the business of any other person, group, or government. So I'm impressed by the sources that you used in the book, using both diplomatic and digital sources. I believe this is the first time, this is the first academic research that uses US diplomatic sources to understand the gay movement. My first question is about your sources. You used Mousavi statements in a very limited way, maybe one time in the last chapter, I believe. I know that the book concentrated on ordinary people and used as a bottom-up, actually, but use a bottom-up approach. But Mousavi and Karoubi play an important role in shaping and leading the movement. Mousavi issued more than 18 statements to define the vision, the boundaries, and the demands of the gay movement. This statement, of course, are one of the key sources to understand the nature of the gay movement. So why didn't book they use them to further support the argument about the contesting the 1979 revolution? And my second question is about the gay movement's challenge to the core values of the Islamic republics. As you mentioned in your book, the gay movement successfully undermined the ideological foundations of Islamic Republic by taking the ownership and the meaning of key symbols of the 1979 revolution. The gay movement took ownership of historical events and ceremonies, slogans, and I think nationals, even nationals, hero Iran-Iraq wars like Hemmat and Bakeri or Kharrazi, or almost all of important families who are part of the revolution's leadership, such as family of Ayatollah Taleghani, Beheshti, Montazeri, Hashemi, and even Ayatollah Khamenei's brother, Said Hadi, and family of Ayatollah Khomeini, all of them came to the support of the gay movement. That's why the gay movement caused a serious damage to the cohesion within the regime and brought about a legitimacy crisis. And that's why I think Ayatollah Khamenei called it as a sedition, fitna, as a very complex situation in which you cannot recognize right from wrong. To me, the Green movement challenged the core of the Islamic Republic's legitimacy by questioning its morality. That the 2009 uprising undermined the Islamic Republic's claim as a replication of Imam Ali's governance that was based on morality, justice, and shura, or the will of people. So the leadership of the movement view the uprising as a moral movement to restore the principles of the revolution. I met Mir Hossein Mousavi privately in March 2010, and I asked him two questions. First, why, as a very close disciple of Ayatollah Khomeini, someone who was the favorite prime minister of Imam, why stood against his legacy, the Islamic Republic? He told me that I am a moral person, and the people took to the streets to support me, and they were killed. I cannot close my eyes and compromise with such a government by saying that the black is white or white is black. My second question from him was, Mr. Aghay Mohandes, whether you have any specific vision or roadmap for the future of the Green movement. Mir Hossein responded that we have two style of painting. As you know, he's an artist. He does watercolors and oil and other artwork. He mentioned that one kind of painting, you know exactly what you want to paint. You know the sketch and the details, and another style, you know the sketch, but you don't know the details. You allow the details to come to life as you are painting. He said that the Green movement is second one, and is the second type, and we know the principles, but let's wait to see what will come next. From what Mousavi said, I think we should look at the Green movement from a moral perspective. This made 2009 uprising as a turning point in Iran after the revolution, and made it a turning point after the revolution. You are arguing that the Green movement challenged the Islamic Republic on ideological and discursive level. I wonder, what do you think about that? About the moral challenge that the Green movement has posed to the Islamic Republic. And as a last question about the long-term impact of the Green movement, your book argued that the Green movement is not over, and you somehow link it to the anti-government protests in 2017 and 2018. You discussed that protesters in 2009, the Green movement, in terms of new generation of Iranians, youth, women, revolutionary leaders, clergy, but what do you think about the class composition of the Green movement? I haven't found any scholarly research that analyzed the class structure of the Green movement. Do you think that the same social forces in the Green movement took a part in protesters in 2017 and 2018 or not? Thank you, and I look forward to hearing your comments.
All right. I wrote these down. I hope I could do them justice as I think about your wonderful questions. Real quick, before we begin, I saw in the chat there was a question from Professor Mansour Farhang, and it was lovely to see his question. I don't know if he remembers me, but when I was an undergrad at UC Berkeley, I hosted a panel with him, Sirus Bina, and I think Abrahamian had a pre-recorded segment on the 50th anniversary of the U.S. overthrow of the Iranian government. So it's a pleasure that he's joining us as well, and I saw his question, and I thank him for his question as well, and hopefully we'll be able to address everything together. So, Hadijan, your question about why I know you understand why I de-emphasized Mousavi in this uprising, but I only include maybe one or two of his statements. I think I talked about the charter he put out in one of the footnotes, because I believe that's where it kind of belonged, because that charter for me kind of spoke to a lot of things, right? And I guess this kind of goes to Professor Fahrenheit's question as well. Mousavi was still part of the system, right? So his charter was speaking to his role in helping to establish the Iranian government, right? And I didn't think that, and as much as Mousavi was the obvious focal point of this uprising, it was under his campaign, and to a lesser extent, much lesser extent, Karoubi, but it was really his campaign. It was under his campaign that the movement crystallized. But to then assume, in my opinion, this is only my opinion, to then assume that this charter spoke for the multifaceted nature of the uprising itself, to me, didn't really hold a lot of water. And the reason why I say so is because Rahnavard herself said that this movement is really one giant umbrella, and that it has created this space for so many, literally millions of Iranians with a whole range of grievances or causes to kind of gather under. And so that's really why I didn't think his charter deserved anything more than a footnote, to be honest with you. And that's also why I didn't quote too many of his statements, because as you summarized, I really wanted to focus on the people on the ground, because I also know that a lot of these events took Mousavi by surprise, and then he had to kind of retroactively kind of endorse them. But it was always a challenge, because I mean, here I was trying to decenter powerful men, but then I have almost an entire chapter just on Montazeri, right? And I am quoting, these people, right, like Rafsanjani and Khomeini and Mousavi. So it was indeed a struggle to go through these 300 pages, and constantly having to remind myself that the focus is the people and not these men. And then yet I was still kind of drawn back to them because of their obvious important role. But that's essentially why I didn't quote them too much. It was just kind of like this internal debate that I was having. In terms of a moral challenge, I didn't actually use that kind of discourse, because I felt like if I was, I'd be imposing my own religious beliefs, and I didn't want to do that. But if you kind of look carefully, I am framing it in a moral challenge discourse without actually saying it, right? So if you look at chapter 4, for instance, the issue of Palestine, right? The Iranian government, as I mentioned, has legitimized itself by becoming the flag bearers of Palestinian liberation, becoming more Catholic than the Pope, right? And then I guess the moral challenge of the uprising was, how can you speak about justice in Palestine when there's so much injustice at home, when batons are being cracked against our heads, when we're doing nothing but peacefully protesting? So in that regard, the uprising was a moral challenge without me actually saying moral challenge, right? I mean, I don't know, maybe you could help me to understand if there's another meaning you had. And the same could be said about Ashura, right? If the legacy of Ashura is to not simply mourn Imam Hussein, but to heed his example and rise up against injustice like he did, then that too was a moral challenge, because on Ashura, protesters came out against the oppression of the state that itself had claimed Hussein's mantle. And this to me was really interesting, because Hamid Dabashi, in his book Shiism, and I think it was Shiism, Social Protest, I forgot the full title, he argued about the paradox that exists in Iran. Whereas Imam Hussein never achieved power, but died fighting it. In Iran, post-revolution, those carrying Hussein's mantle are the ultimate arbiters of power in Iran. And so when they're resisting the United States and its military domination and wars in the region, they are playing that underdog story of Imam Hussein. They're enlivening it in that way. But domestically, that's when you see that contrast, when they're the final arbiters of power within Iran's borders. And then on December 27th, they face the moral challenge, if you wanted to put it that way, the moral challenge of those protesters that came out and said, "In mah khun ast, Sayyid Ali sarnagun ast." This month is a month of blood. Sayyid Ali Khamenei will be overthrown. But I mean, there's plenty of room for debate. I did really try to steer clear of using that kind of terminology, but in doing so, I may have kind of evaded a whole segment of the population. I don't know. That's for you to assess. In terms of class composition, I can't really speak to the class composition. I think there's a general understanding that the Green Movement was a middle class youth and woman-led movement generally, right? Not entirely. And that the 2017, 2018 was working class, right? But these are all generalizations, right? So I'm sure there's studies to be had. The only thing is it's incredibly difficult to do a lot of this research inside the country, just because it's the government. The Iranian government does not want this history to be told. They want to kind of like, they want people to forget it. And so this is why I felt like I got a basically the Green Movement itself, the protesters themselves, gave me the keys I needed to do this research, right? And in doing so, there's this potential to fall victim to their narrative, which is why I contrasted everything with the Iranian government, right? So that I don't fall victim to one side's narrative. And there's obvious value in that, right? So there was the case of I forgot his first name, Ruhul Amini, the son of the advisor to Mohsen Rezai. He died as an opposition protester. He died in Kahrizak prison, and he was essentially the son of the advisor to one of the conservative candidates, one of the four candidates, two conservative, two moderate or reformist. And when he died, the Iranian government said that he died of meningitis. And then because there was all this uproar, and the opposition media was making their own allegations, the Iranian government had to really come clean, do an investigation, and admitted that he died from basically wounds or torture, right? So, like I said, it's kind of hard to do this research inside the country, but the opposition kind of gave me the keys, and I was able to kind of contrast that with the state narratives, and through my own analysis, hopefully I came at what I think is the truth. And whenever there was something that was very sensitive, when there was a claim that was sensitive, I ended up putting like 3 or 4 different credible sources, right? I didn't just stick to one. I didn't just stick to BBC Persian, for instance, obviously, right? I didn't really quote BBC Persian, but whenever there was a sensitive claim, I had to triangulate it with multiple sources. So I almost had conversations with myself in the citations. Yeah, okay. Should we proceed, or because I see some of these questions?
So, there's a number of questions that have been asked, and also some have been sent to us privately. But I thought I would select a few and perhaps combine a few. Let me start out by asking, though, from a political science perspective, it's not surprising that the opposition used the language and the dates to coordinate opposition or even subversion against the state. The central challenge is coordinating, getting enough people out in the streets. It's not. In fact, the 2009 presidential election and the fact that it's the Green Uprisings, I think, speaks to this, right? This is the colored revolutions of Eastern Europe were similar, where it was these state-led events, including elections, that the opposition used to get their foot in the door. But it's unsurprising that the opposition uses these. You use language like co-opt, appropriate, reprogram, and leveled it against the state. But you could also say that it's easier for the regime to anticipate. They know these dates. It's easier for the regime to control, to limit dissent, to limit the protest when the opposition is so reliant on using the same language and dates. And so there's a tension there. And I wasn't yet convinced in your larger argument that the opposition's appropriation of these has fundamentally undermined the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic.
So, it's a wonderful point. I think that the Iranian government was stunned by it initially and then tried to stop it, ended up canceling some of the religious holidays. But then there were certain things they couldn't cancel, tried to give as many warnings as possible, including Jerusalem Day, which is really funny because, I had a statement from Khomeini that Jerusalem Day was a day of solidarity with the Palestinians and Jerusalem, but also a day of solidarity with the state that champions their liberation. Then all of a sudden in 2009, and so I think it was September 18th, Jerusalem Day, Khomeini was so worried that this day would be co-opted like the other days had been co-opted, and came out and said, this is a day of solidarity with the Palestinians, don't conflate it with anything else. Whereas Khomeini said this is the day of solidarity with the Palestinians and the government that champions their liberation. Khomeini was now trying to repackage Jerusalem Day. Let's not talk about the government. It's all about Palestinian liberation. So that's how you kind of really see the Iranian government itself began to anticipate these things and was very much sensing that there was these occasions were being used to protest it. But then as it continued, really Ashura is kind of the day that changed it. 6 months later, the Iranian government thought, because there was a 2-month lull between September 18th, Jerusalem Day, and November 4th, 6 weeks. So November 4th being the anniversary of the seizure of the U.S. Embassy. Then from November 4th, there was about a 1-month lull, December 7th, National Student Day. The Iranian government was hoping this would taper out. This protest movement would taper out in these big gaps of protest. Then on December, there was 3. There was National Student Day, the death of Montazeri, and then Ashura. And then Ashura was the day that the Iranian government really was like, we got to deal with this in a proper way, right? Whatever we've been doing hasn't worked. Because now they're being equated. The Islamic government was now being equated with the murders of Yazid. That was blasphemous. They actually said this is blasphemy. This is desecration of our religion and our holidays. So then they really went all out, right? So when you say anticipation, they really begin to anticipate the February 11th protest. This is the anniversary of Pouya. This is the anniversary of the revolution. This is Iran's prime political holiday. This is like the equivalence of the 4th of July, Independence Day celebration. So the Iranian government then kind of goes above and beyond to really kind of deal a death knell, a nail in the coffin of the Green Movement. So what did they do? I think the day fell on like a Wednesday. And Friday is the day of rest, and then I think there was like some sort of like holy day on Saturday, one of the imam's birthdays or something, and then they gave Thursday off too, so it would be a long weekend. So a lot of these people who might come to protest the Iranian government, well, they're also dealing with the 4-day weekend. Maybe they will instead go on vacation. And then it set up loudspeakers all along the avenues, and then bust in millions of its own supporters, and then really kind of had militiamen or patrol out there targeting people who they thought were there to voice anti-government slogans. And this day really was a day where everyone kind of went all in, right? The Green Movement was like, this is the day we're going to finally bring the system down. And then the government was like, this is the day we are anticipating, as you put it, and now we're going to bring the Green Movement to an end. And if it's a poker game, they all went all in, and the Green Movement basically lost that day. This is the day they were unable to hijack like they had done before or appropriate. And the Iranian government celebrated this as a day where the Iranian nation renewed its bay'ah, its pledge of allegiance to the Islamic system, right? And declared it a day of God, Yomullah, and showed helicopter footage of all these demonstrations, Pouya, February 11th demonstrations throughout the country to really kind of hammer the point to the national audience that the Iranian government, despite this opposition, still enjoys support from at least a significant portion of the society. I can't quantify it, but it was significant. And that's how they were able to weather the storm of the uprising. Whereas if you look at the Arab Spring, a lot of those uprisings were not as long as the Green Movement. Maybe did not have the same numbers. And I don't want to compare because the systems are very different. I understand that. But the key point is that a lot of these systems in the Arab governments, especially the presidential systems, collapsed under the weight of these uprisings. Whereas the Iranian government not only did not collapse, didn't give an inch to the opposition, and then went and saved an Arab government that dealt with its own Arab uprising in Syria. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I actually just forgot the question. We went off on a tangent.
That's okay. So there's a number, in the vein of anticipating, Gary Seymour, the director of the Crown Center, asked, the Green Uprising was triggered by a contested presidential election. Do you see any signs that the upcoming presidential elections in Iran could produce similar public protests? And I'll add a second part of that. Did 2009, what happened, do you think that affects which candidates the system allows to run? Have Iranian elections been changed? What type of reformist is allowed to run because of what happened in 2009?
Great questions. Wow. Okay. So by the way, now that we talked about anticipation, I did remember your question, and I hope I addressed it. It's wonderful to receive Professor Seymour's question. I will just say that I remember in 2009, some academics were making predictions about the uprising. One even said that early on, maybe in the summer still, they said that on this day, there's Green Movement activists preparing to protest on one of these days of action. And if the Iranian government doesn't heed their demands, the country will be in a state of civil war afterwards. And it seemed really amateurish when he talked about civil war. So he basically made a prediction that didn't come true and then had to make another prediction that didn't come true. It just became this mess. So as a historian, I'm not keen on making predictions, right? Because then you just look really dumb when they don't come true. I think the only thing I'll say is that, and this kind of leads into your second question, David, is that there are a lot of calls for boycotts. And I think that unlike 2009, there's a good chance many will heed those calls, right? But, and that's potentially our segue to the second question. How did the Green Movement inform the government's decision to allow certain candidates to run? The government wants to have, obviously, a certain president in charge, but also still wants to have candidates that can appeal to large segments of society, so that people do vote, right? Like I said, voting in the elections, you're participating in a very important state-sanctioned holiday. You're legitimizing the system, even if that's not your intention. By voting, you're legitimizing. And so, in my opinion, I think that Hassan Rouhani, who we sometimes refer to him as a reformist in the Western media, he's not a reformist, but he's very much a centrist. I think he's a product of the fact that the Iranian government wanted to appeal to those who were burned out by Ahmadinejad and what happened in 2009, get them back into this process, right? And I think also the nuclear or the nuclear negotiations, the fact that Iran essentially surrendered its nuclear program without with what it thought were guarantees that turned out to be non-guarantees, as we see with Trump negating the JCPOA. But Iran essentially surrendered its nuclear program. That too, I think, is a product, in part, it's hard to quantify this, but I think that too is in part a result of the Green Movement, because it was I think the thing that stunned the Iranian government was that it didn't anticipate this much widespread opposition. And when in 2011, the Obama administration then began to sanction Iran to the T, the Iranian government was worried that those sanctions and the downward spiral of the Iranian economy would then trigger more protests. And that made it more susceptible to that surrendering of its nuclear program. And this should not be too hard to kind of fathom, because the protests that happened in 2019, Aban month, and 2017, these were in part economic protests, political, but also economic protests. So that's why I think that the Green Movement has not only informed the Iranian government's decision to allow such candidates like Hassan Rouhani to run, and we'll see who they allow to run in this elections this summer, but has informed a lot of its policy, including and potentially the surrender of its nuclear program.
So there was an anonymous question asked: Did the Green Movement make a mistake by insisting on election fraud in 2009? Should it have stuck with its political and social demands only?
Well, it's one of those things. Well, I mean, we're looking at things with the benefit of hindsight, right? So we got to look at things as they happen. So, and I think this is, again, speaks to one of the successes to the Green Movement, right? So it went from saying, where is my vote? Because that's what was the catalyst for them to protest. That's what they were saying in June. And then the crackdown and the hardening of the movement, or the removal of the martyr voices because of so when Neda Agha Sodan was killed on June 20th, a lot of fathers and mothers saw this happen to a daughter, essentially, and they began to fight tooth and nail to keep their sons and daughters home, right? So you see the movement decreasing in numbers, but a lot of moderate voices either stayed at home or they grew hardened by that repression. So then the slogans begin to change. It went from "Where's my vote?" in June to "This month is a month of blood. Said Ali Khamenei will be overthrown" in December. And I think that's one of the things about the Green Movement that cross-pollinated into other protests, because that taboo was broken, right? No one publicly demonstrated against Khamenei really before 2009, right? Khamenei was considered to be above all this. It was politically and socially taboo. And then you see the Green Movement beginning with "Where's my vote?" and ending with "Death to Khamenei." And then all the other protests that have happened since picked up where the Green Movement left off, targeting specifically the poster boy of the Iranian government, Sayyid Ali Khamenei, and the whole institution of the Velayat Faqih. So that's why I think the Green Movement has been successful in that regard. It's not a complete failure, right? They have shattered a lot of these taboos that have continued with other protests. And that's also what I mean when I say that the subsequent protests were not about the Green Movement. They were not about Ahmadinejad, but they were still informed by the legacy, such as shattering the taboo of targeting politically the Faqih, Ayatollah Khamenei.
Well, so building on that, we have a question from one of our advanced PhD students, Human Aliai, who says, almost a decade after the Green Movement, Iran has witnessed a couple of other major protests, 2017, 18, 19, and the protests in 2019 were not the first instances of street movements in Iran. Protests in 1999 and major street protests in Mashhad even in 1992. So he asks, from your perspective, what's the significance of the Green Movement in a broader historical perspective? And how is the Green Movement different from its predecessors and those successor movements' protests?
Yeah, so this goes to the core of the book, right? This is the whole thing where we've had protests before 2009, but 2009 was a turning point. Now, there was the protest in 1999 when I was a student at Berkeley as Iranian students in the United States. We protested in solidarity with those in Iran who were protesting against against Hashem Aghajari being sentenced to death. He was a war veteran who came out. He's a University of Tehran professor, war veteran, who came out and said Muslims shouldn't merely follow clergy blindly, right? God has given us reason and a brain. We should use it and not just let them be sources of emulation. We just follow them blindly. And then he was sentenced to death for that. And we protested in Berkeley alongside of them in solidarity with them. So there is this history of protests before 2009 and certainly after. But 2009 is really important because it's a turning point. Like I said, all those sources of legitimation, it was the Green Movement was a systematic assault on the Iranian government's sources of legitimacy. Then that's really important because the Iranian ideology was powerful, I should say. And it's a shell of its former self since 2009. Now it's this powerful repressive military apparatus, and that's how it has been. It's a very militarized state, but at least it had a claim to ideology and revolution and all these things. Since 2009, that claim is now in dispute. Right. And like I said, maybe like moments ago, again, with the turning point in 2009 and onwards is that now people can politically, openly, publicly come out and say death to Velayat Faqih, death to Khamenei, death to the entire system. Whereas before that, it was much more sporadic or maybe even entirely taboo and no one really spoke about it publicly. People thought of it, but they didn't really come out openly in gatherings and declare it. That's the turning point. That's the legacy of 2009.
So Mohammed Attai, who's one of our postdocs here at the Crown Center, he asked about a different pillar of support for the Islamic Republic. He says you persuasively argue that the Green Movement was successful in contesting the Iranian Revolution on an ideological and discursive level. But he asks, to what extent do you think the Green Movement was able to use the mosque and the khutbah, the Friday prayer networks, which are mostly under control of the leader, to mobilize Iranians in 2009? He asks this because you very prominently cite Kurzman, who emphasized the importance of that as one of the factors in the 78, 79 mobilizations against the Shah.
Yeah, so exactly, right? The Iranian government came to power through that revolution, and it was very cognizant of these spaces. And I go through this as well. Like my parents are both graduates of the University of Tehran. They both saw how post-revolution, because the University of Tehran was a very leftist center of opposition. And then all of a sudden, post-revolution, the country's main Friday prayer hall was established at essentially the most leftist university in Tehran. And that was the Iranian government kind of carving out this space and staking a claim at the University of Tehran of all places, right? And really that was a symbolism, or that became a symbol of what was to come, that the Iranian government really took over the mosque, right? They understood that the mosque was really important to the revolution, and now it's an Islamic Republic, and therefore the office of the supreme leader appoints all their Friday prayer leaders, and that kind of at least facilitates to a certain degree the idea that these spaces will not be used for anti-regime activity. That doesn't mean that's not the case. That doesn't mean that hasn't happened. So Rafsanjani gave a Friday sermon. Rafsanjani, a regime insider, gave a Friday sermon right after the elections in 2012, and that became an excuse for people to gather. We don't really know how many people gathered. Some estimates put it at 1 million people gathered, and people who had never gone to a Friday sermon before. Youth who had been raised in Iran, who just never went, all of a sudden found themselves going because they understood that this was now being, at least this one time, was being used as a space for protest activity. But really, post-revolution, the universities became, whereas in 1978, 79, it was both the mosque and the university and the bazaar that became spaces of activity. Post-revolution, some of those spaces had decreased in importance, like the bazaar. Some of those spaces had been completely taken over by the state, like the mosque, but the university continued to be a space, even though the Iranian government has really tried to populate those universities with its own supporters and carve out spaces for its own purposes, like the University of Tehran's Friday prayer hall. It still continues to be a center or centers of protest activity, the universities.
So we only have a few minutes left. So let me ask a final question. This is from Paul Arts at the University of Amsterdam, who asked, I think what's a really key question, touches on a lot of the other issues that you've talked about, which such as the comparison with other regimes in the Arab Spring. These protest movements, do they really have any success defined a certain way, right? You've talked about the success of the Green Movement a different way, but in a traditional sense, as long as there's no serious split within the regime. In other words, unless there's cleavage, light within the regime that the protest movement can take advantage of, are we likely just to see these repeated fails in a traditional sense?
Yeah, so splits at the top are very important. Again, those splits kind of mean that the government is not speaking with one voice. It creates allies for the opposition. Like they saw, even though Rafsanjani was a regime insider, they saw him as an ally and they used his Friday sermon to gather. But I think really the issue as to why these uprisings are not able to kind of really implement wide-scale change, I think kind of goes to what I tried to say in the conclusion. I don't know how successful I was. And really, this is what Iran kind of shares with its Arab counterparts in the Arab Spring. There were mass movements from below that really kind of lacked a bona fide ideology that would supplant the entire system. And they lacked revolutionary leadership, right? So, Mousavi he was revolutionary in the Islamist sense in the 80s, as Professor Farhang mentioned in his comment, but he wasn't a revolutionary anymore in 2009, right? Khomeini was in 78, 79, right? And it was a mass revolution in 78, 79, but there was ideology, leadership, organizations, revolutionary leaders, revolutionary organizations, the Fadayan, the Mujahideen, the Tudeh, all these revolutionary organizations existed, and they all came together for revolution. And they weren't just saying the Shah has to go. They wanted to do away with the entire system, right? A lot of the problems with a lot of the protests that happen around the world today is that they're mass movements, but not real revolutionary ideology or leadership. And they're mass movements who hope that the state will then change itself. And really what ends up happening is the state will overthrow Hosni Mubarak or somebody, and then everything else will continue. The entire social structure will continue unchanged. Whereas in the Iranian Revolution, everything was laid to waste. Constitution, the system, the uber elites, the financial military blast, everybody who had to flee the country. And they started completely afresh. The Green Movement wasn't ready for all that at the time because Mousavi was still part of the system.
So Pouya, Hadi, I just want to thank both of you. This has been a terrific final seminar for the Crown Seminar Series this academic year. For all of you in attendance, you'll receive an email, hopefully in the coming hours, asking you to complete a very short survey, literally 2 to 5 minutes maximum. And we'd greatly appreciate if you could fill that out because we anticipate continuing this format of seminars next academic year and into the future for a variety of reasons. So please look for that. And I'd also like to, since it's our final seminar, I'd like to thank Christina Chernyahivsky, the Associate Director of the Crown Center, and especially Karen Spira, who does it all at the Crown Center, for helping the seminar series make the shift to a virtual format to make it so seamless, or make it at least from the perspective of outsiders, seem so seamless. They did a tremendous job this year helping us get our feet under us during this challenging year. So please join me in thanking Pouya and Hadi. And I wish all of you a happy end of your semesters in summer. And we look forward to seeing you back with us in the fall for a new series of seminars. Thank you very much.
Thank you all as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you.